Every night, without fail, the dog growled at the child's bedroom door. At first, the father thought it was just odd behavior. Maybe the dog was being overprotective. But then the growls turned into snarls, his hackles raised, teeth bared. Something was wrong, very wrong. So the father set up a camera to find out the truth. What he saw, it shook him to his core. Dogs have an incredible sense of intuition. They can sense danger before humans even realize something is off. But in this case, the dog wasn't just sensing danger. He was actively trying to warn his family every single night. Yet they ignored him until the father saw what was happening when they weren't looking. And the truth, it was something no parent would ever want to face. The Simmons family had always trusted Max. He wasn't just a pet, he was family. A strong, dependable German shepherd. Max had been with them for years. He had watched over their son Oliver from the day they brought him home from the hospital. If anyone ever got too close to Oliver at the park, Max would step in, standing guard like a silent protector. He was the kind of dog you could trust with your life. But now, something was wrong. At first, it was subtle, little things they barely noticed. Max pacing near Oliver's room at bedtime, his ears twitching at every small sound. Then it escalated, every night, without fail. As soon as they tucked Oliver in and turned off the lights, Max would position himself outside the boy's door, his body tense, his ears pricked, his amber eyes locked onto something unseen. And then he would start growling, a low, guttural sound, deep in his throat. It wasn't loud at first, more like a warning, a sound that made the hairs on your arms stand up. The first time it happened, Mrs. Simmons chuckled. Looks like Max is playing watchdog tonight. Her husband, Mark, nodded. Maybe he just feels extra protective. They didn't think much of it. After all, dogs were naturally alert, right? Maybe he had heard a mouse on the walls. Maybe it was just a weird habit. But then it got worse. The next night, the growling started earlier. By the time they had finished their bedtime story and kissed Oliver goodnight, Max was already stationed outside the door, his stance rigid, his tail stiff. This time, his growls weren't just warnings. They were sharper, more aggressive, like a dog on the verge of attacking something unseen. Mark furrowed his brows. That's weird. What is? His wife asked, watching Max warily. He's never done this before, Mark murmured. Not like this. Mrs. Simmons crouched down, reaching a hand toward Max's fur. Hey, buddy, what's wrong? Max barely acknowledged her touch. His muscles were tight, his attention locked on the door. His growls grew louder. Mark swallowed hard. All right, that's enough. He grabbed Max's collar and gently pulled him away. Go on, boy. To your bed. Max resisted. For the first time ever, he refused to obey. Instead, he lunged. Not at them, at the door. His claws scraped against the wood. His bark exploded in the hallway, deep and booming, echoing through the house. Oliver whimpered from inside his room. Mommy. Mrs. Simmons's heart pounded. Mark, something is wrong. I know, he muttered. Max's tail was stiff as a rod, his teeth bared, his entire body vibrating with tension. He wasn't just growling anymore. He was warning, but warning them about what? The Simmons family tried everything. They thought maybe Max was just anxious. Maybe a recent change had upset him. They moved his bed to another part of the house, thinking distance would calm him. But that only made him worse. He would race back to Oliver's door every night, no matter where they placed him. They took him on longer walks, thinking maybe he just had too much energy. Didn't help. They even took him to the vet, running tests to make sure he wasn't sick or in pain. The vet smiled after checking Max over. He's in perfect health. In fact, for his age, he's in excellent shape. Mark sighed. Then why does he keep growling at my son's door every night? The vet hesitated. Some dogs, they sense things. Mark raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The vet chuckled lightly, clearly not wanting to spook them. Just that dogs have heightened senses. They can pick up on changes in the environment, things we can't see or hear. Maybe there's a sound in the walls, or a new smell that's unsettling him. That explanation made sense at first, but then something happened that made them question everything. It was 2:14 a.m. when Mrs. Simmons shot up in bed, her heart racing. A scream, Oliver's scream. She barely had time to react before Mark was already out of bed, sprinting down the hallway. By the time she reached the door, Mark was already inside, holding Oliver in his arms. The boy was shaking. Tears streamed down his cheeks, his little hands gripping his dad's shirt like a lifeline. Sure, it's okay, Mark whispered, stroking Oliver's back. Daddy's here. But Oliver wouldn't stop crying. His body trembled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then Mrs. Simmons noticed Max. He was inside the room, standing at the foot of Oliver's bed, his lips curled back in a snarl. his teeth bared, his eyes locked on the closet. The closet door was open, just an inch. Mark's grip on Oliver tightened. "Oliver," he said slowly, keeping his voice calm, "did you have a bad dream?" The boy nodded frantically. "What did you see?" his mother asked gently. Oliver hesitated, his small hands fisted in his father's shirt. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "There was a man in my room." Mrs. Simmons felt her blood run cold. Mark stiffened. "A man?" Oliver nodded. "He was standing in the corner, watching me." Mrs. Simmons turned to Mark, panic creeping into her voice. "Check the house." Mark handed Oliver to her and grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed. He moved cautiously, checking the closet first. Nothing. He checked under the bed. Nothing. Then he moved through the hallway, checking every door, every window, every possible entrance. The house was locked. Every door, every window, every latch. There was no way someone could have gotten in. And yet, Max was still growling, and Oliver still insisted. There was a man in his room. That was the night everything changed. From that moment on, Oliver's nightmares got worse. Every night, he woke up screaming. Every night, Max refused to leave his door. And the worst part? Oliver started talking in his sleep. Sometimes, his parents would hear him whispering in the middle of the night, words that didn't make sense, half sentences, a soft, one-sided conversation. Mrs. Simmons would stand outside his room, listening, but the moment she opened the door, Oliver would go silent, like he knew she was there, like he was hiding something. Then came the night when Max snapped, not at Oliver, but at something else, something they couldn't see. And that was the moment Mark decided, enough was enough. He was going to find out what was happening once and for all. So he set up a camera, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The nightmares didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Oliver wasn't just waking up crying anymore. He was screaming, terrified, shaking, drenched in sweat. Every time his parents rushed into the room, they found him gasping for air, his tiny body trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. "What's wrong, buddy?" his father asked again and again, holding him close. But Oliver would just shake his head. He couldn't explain it, or maybe he wouldn't. Max, on the other hand, was acting more erratic than ever. He didn't just growl anymore. He barked, snarled. Every night, the barking grew more urgent, more aggressive. He paced outside Oliver's door, his claws scraping the hardwood floor, his body tense like he was ready to attack. Mrs. Simmons was growing more and more uneasy. "Mark, something isn't right." "I know," Mark admitted. He could feel it, a wrongness in the air, something he couldn't put his finger on. It was like the house itself felt different at night, like something was watching them. Then, one night, something new happened. The parents woke up not to Oliver screaming, but to something even worse, whispering, soft, muffled, a voice in the dark. Mrs. Simmons bolted upright in bed. "Did you hear that?" Mark was already sitting up, listening. A second later, Max let out a low, warning growl from outside Oliver's door. Mrs. Simmons's pulse pounded in her ears. "Oliver." No answer, just the soft, rhythmic whispering. It was coming from Oliver's room. Mark grabbed his phone, using the flashlight as he stepped into the hallway. The beam of light caught Max, standing rigid outside Oliver's door, his fur bristling. Max turned his head toward Mark, his eyes dark, intense. He didn't move from his spot, didn't stop growling. Mark's stomach tightened. He pushed open Oliver's door. The whispering stopped. Oliver was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed, staring at the closet. Mark swallowed. "Buddy, who are you talking to?" Oliver didn't answer right away. Then, in a quiet, almost too calm voice, he said, "The man in the corner." Mark felt ice crawl up his spine. He whipped his flashlight toward the corner of the room. Nothing. The closet door was closed. The windows were shut. But Max wasn't barking at the closet. He was staring into the empty corner. Mark didn't sleep that night. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and he needed to see it for himself. So the next night, after tucking Oliver in, he set up a camera. He placed it high on the bookshelf, angling it toward Oliver's bed. If something was happening at night, he was going to find out. At 2 a.m., Max started growling again. Mark and his wife were already awake, listening. Then came Oliver's scream. This time, Mark didn't run. He forced himself to wait, to listen. Oliver whimpered, "No, please go away." A thud sounded from the room, a soft shuffling noise. Then Oliver screamed. Mark bolted out of bed, racing down the hall. Max was already there, barking wildly, his entire body shaking with tension. Mark threw open the door. The closet was open. Oliver was curled in the corner of the bed, hugging his knees, tears streaming down his face. Max was standing between him and the closet, his growls so deep they didn't sound like a dog anymore. Mark rushed to his son, scooping him into his arms. "It's okay, I've got you," he murmured. his own heart hammering against his ribs. Mrs. Simmons flicked on the light. The room looked normal. The closet was empty, but Oliver was still shaking. And Max wouldn't stop staring. Not at the bed, not at Oliver, but at the closet. Mark didn't wait until morning. He sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, scrolling through the footage with shaky fingers. Hours passed. The video showed Oliver sleeping peacefully. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, at exactly 2:03 a.m., Max sat up. His ears perked. His body stiffened. He turned toward the closet. Then, out of nowhere, Oliver began to shift in his sleep. His breathing quickened. His body twitched. Then, his lips moved. He started whispering, but he wasn't whispering to himself. His head turned, his unfocused, half-asleep eyes fixed on the dark corner of the room. Mark's breath caught. Then, at 2:07 a.m., the closet door creaked open. By itself, Oliver twitched in his sleep. His whispering grew louder. Max was growling, louder. Then, at 2:08 a.m., something moved. A shadow, a shape, just for a second. A figure, tall and thin, shifting in the darkness, stepping out of the closet. Oliver stopped whispering, and then his eyes snapped open, and he screamed. The footage shook as Max launched himself at the shadow, snarling, barking, his teeth snapping at the air. The shadow moved, not walked, not ran. It flickered, like a candle flame, twisting and disappearing before the light switched on. The closet door slammed shut. The footage ended. Mark sat in the dark, hands shaking, heart pounding, watching the screen over and over. He couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't Max overreacting. Something was in Oliver's room. Something had been watching him, and Max had been trying to protect him this whole time. Mark's breath felt trapped in his chest as he clicked play. The footage started normally. Oliver, tucked into bed, his small chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. His nightlight cast a soft golden glow. The shadows in the room still undisturbed. But then something changed. Just past midnight, at 12:03 a.m., the closet door creaked. Not wide, not all at once, just an inch. Mark's stomach clenched as he watched the tiny shift in the door. So slow, so deliberate, as if something inside the closet was testing the air. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then a shadow moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of darkness against the dim light. But then it stretched, grew. Mark leaned closer to the screen. The shadow wasn't just moving, it was stepping forward. His hands turned ice cold. He told himself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe the angle of the camera, or a weird reflection from outside. But deep down he knew that wasn't a trick, that wasn't light, that was something else. Oliver shifted in his sleep, a small twitch, a faint whimper. Then his lips moved. The whispering was so soft at first, the cameras might barely picked it up. Mark cranked the volume. His skin crawled, because Oliver wasn't whispering in his normal voice. It was lower, hollow, almost like an echo, and it wasn't English. Mark couldn't understand it, but his gut told him this wasn't right. Oliver's body tensed, as if something was holding him down. His fingers twitched against the blankets. His breathing grew shallow. And then, Max appeared. Max's entrance was sudden. One moment, the hallway was empty. The next, he was there, storming into the room, his body low, his tail stiff, his teeth bared. His growl wasn't like anything Mark had ever heard before. It wasn't just a warning, it was pure rage. Max's eyes locked onto the shadow in the corner, the same one stepping closer to Oliver's bed. Then he snarled. The deep, guttural sound sent a shiver up Mark's spine. And that's when Oliver sat up, eyes still closed, his mouth moving faster now, whispering, chanting, words Mark couldn't understand. Mark's entire body stiffened. Something was wrong. This wasn't just sleep talking. Oliver's face was blank, emotionless. His hands clenched the sheets so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, suddenly, he screamed. The sound ripped through the speakers, sharp, raw, filled with terror. Max lunged, straight at the shadow. For a split second, the shadow reacted. Not like a person, not like an animal, like something unnatural. It twisted, shifting backward as if the air itself was pulling it away. Then, the closet door slammed shut. Mark jumped so hard his chair nearly tipped over. The screen glitched. Just for a second, static flickered across the video, warping the image. And then, everything stopped. The only sound left was Max, panting, standing protectively over Oliver's bed, his body still trembling from the attack. Oliver, he slumped back against the pillow, as if nothing had happened, as if he had never screamed at all. Mark paused the footage. His hands were shaking. His heart thundered, so hard it physically hurt. What had he just witnessed? He dragged a shaky hand down his face, forcing himself to breathe. There had to be an explanation. Maybe a draft pushed the closet open. Maybe Oliver was just having a bad dream. But deep down, he knew that wasn't a dream. That wasn't a draft. That was something else. And whatever it was, it had been watching his son, waiting, whispering. And if Max hadn't been there, Mark couldn't even finish the thought. His stomach turned. This thing, whatever it was, had been in his house, right next to his child. And now that he had seen it, he had no idea if it was gone, or if it was still there, watching, waiting, for another night. Mark didn't sleep that night. How could he? After watching the footage, after seeing what had been inside his son's room, sleep was the last thing on his mind. He spent the rest of the night, sitting by Oliver's bed, Max curled at his feet, eyes still darting toward the closet, as if daring whatever had been there to come back. But nothing happened. Still, Mark knew he couldn't ignore it. This wasn't just a bad dream. This wasn't just nightmares. Something had been in that room, and it wasn't human. The next morning, Mark did what any rational father would do. He took Oliver to a doctor, a child psychologist. He explained the screaming, the sleep disturbances, the strange behavior. He even hesitated before mentioning the whispering, because how do you tell a doctor that your child was speaking in a voice that wasn't his own? But as soon as he mentioned the nightmares, the psychologist nodded knowingly. Night terrors, she said. Mark frowned. They're more common than people think. Children sometimes experience sleep paralysis, hallucinations, or even episodes of sleep talking that sound unnatural. The words made sense. They did. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Because what about the shadow? What about the closet door? What about Max? That wasn't just a dog reacting to a bad dream. That was a dog protecting his family. So when the doctor suggested relaxation techniques and therapy, Mark nodded. But in his mind, he knew this wasn't something a doctor could fix. That night, Mark sat at his laptop, researching. He looked up everything. Night terrors, sleep paralysis, childhood hallucinations. But none of it explained what he saw on the footage. None of it explained why Max reacted the way he did. And then, deep into the night, Mark's search led him somewhere else. Somewhere he never thought he'd go. A forum about paranormal encounters. He hesitated. It felt stupid. He was a rational man, a logical thinker. But then he remembered Oliver's voice in that recording, the way the closet moved on its own, and the way Max had thrown himself between his son and whatever was in that room. So, against every instinct, he posted. He shared what had happened, the growling, the screaming, the shadow, and the responses. They terrified him, because they all said the same thing. You need to cleanse your house. Mark wasn't sure he believed in ghosts, but at this point, he wasn't willing to take any chances. He found a local paranormal investigator, an older man named Ethan Wells. Ethan didn't laugh when Mark told him what happened. He didn't call him crazy. Instead, he listened, and when Mark showed him the footage, Ethan's face went pale. This isn't just a haunting, Ethan murmured, his voice deadly serious. Mark's stomach clenched. Then what is it? Ethan exhaled. It's something that's been feeding off your son. Mark felt sick. Feeding. Like a parasite? Ethan explained that some entities don't just haunt. They latch onto people, especially children. They feed off their energy, their fears. And night terrors? They weren't just nightmares. They were a sign that something was pushing into his son's mind. And Max had sensed it from the beginning. That's why he had growled. That's why he had barked. He had been fighting something none of them could see. Mark didn't hesitate. He told Ethan to do whatever it took to get rid of it. Ethan walked through the house, murmuring under his breath, holding a small bundle of sage and holy water. Max followed him the entire time, his tail stiff, his ears alert. It was almost as if the dog understood what was happening. And when Ethan reached Oliver's room, the temperature dropped. Mark felt it. The air turned heavy. Max's lips pulled back, a deep snarl vibrating through his chest. Ethan turned to Mark, voice urgent. Keep Oliver out of this room. Now. Mark didn't argue. He grabbed his son, carrying him into the living room. Then he heard it, a slam, the closet door. Even from the hallway, he could hear Max barking. Then, a low, inhuman whisper. Not Oliver's, not Ethan's, something else. Mark's entire body went cold. Then silence, for what felt like an eternity. Then Ethan stepped out. His face was pale, his breath shaky. It's gone, he said, and Mark believed him. Because that night, for the first time in weeks, Max didn't growl, Oliver didn't scream, and the closet door, it never opened again. Mark never showed Oliver the footage. He never told him what really happened. Because how do you explain that to a child? How do you tell your son that something had been feeding off his fear? That something had been watching him in the dark? You don't. You just protect them. And that's exactly what Max had been doing all along. From the very first night, life slowly returned to normal. Oliver's nightmares stopped. He slept peacefully, no longer waking in terror. And Max stayed by his side, still watchful, still alert, but he never growled at the door again. And Mark knew. Max had done his job. He had protected his family from something they never would have understood, and he had won. Sometimes, we don't understand why animals act the way they do, but maybe, just maybe, they see what we can't. If you want to hear more incredible stories like this, hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next one.